This project actually started out looking at the question about whether or not trout stocked into Lake Eildon actually contributed to the fisheries in the feeder streams. For us to answer that question, we needed to have a fairly good method of being able to distinguish the fish. So really this is how this talk evolved, and I'd just like to acknowledge Fletcher Warren Myers from University of Melbourne, who's a collaborator on this project. We periodically stock large numbers of trout into Lake Eildon, and we've been doing that for quite a few decades. But the question is, we really don't know whether or not these fish are contributing to the streams that feed into Lake Eildon. And equally so, we really don't know a lot about whether or not these fish are moving back from the streams back into Lake Eildon. So in terms of the number of fish that have been stocked, this is just the records from snobs going back to the 1970s. As you can see, periodic stockings. In some years there's been quite a few go in. I'd just like to point out that some of these big bars here represent fairly small fish, so upwards of 400,000 in 1 year. They're less than 25 grams in size, so fairly small. But by and large, over the last 5 years, we're typically stocking about 50,000 trout a year. So back to the question, do bad trout stock into the lake? What are they doing and where are they going? So how do we answer this question? We need to know and distinguish these fish that we stock into the lake from the fish that are inhabiting the streams that feed into the lake itself. So we need a tagging method. The options we've got available to us, there are actually quite a lot of different options out there. Jason talked earlier about using acoustic or telemetry tags for a specific purpose. And really the options that we got are dictated by the management questions that we're asking. But the key points to consider here in selecting the right tagging option, I've just listed a few here. The size of the fish that we want to tag, the durability of the tag, how long will that tag last on the fish? Ideally we want it to last the life of the fish. We don't want that tag to inhibit the growth of the fish or the behaviour of the fish. We certainly don't want it to affect its susceptibility to predation. It needs to be quick and easy, needs to be cost effective, and we need to have a mark that there's no confusion about the fish, whether it's marked or non-marked. So discrimination of that mark, identification of the mark needs to be fairly clear cut. You already heard that for quite a long time we've been tagging or fin clipping fish at Snobs Creek. We started doing this back in the 1980s, so there's a long history. Typically it involves removal of the adipose fins, this fin on the back, just removing it like this, or we might also be able to use removal of one or two of the pelvic fins. So to point the note here, limited number of marks, removal of one fin or another, and limited number of fish that we can tag. So these are the Mansfield guys. They spent a weekend at Snobs Creek. They fin clipped about 10,000 fish. If we wanted to fin clip all the fish we reproduce at Snobs Creek, in excess of 600,000 fish a year, I sort of calculate that out to be something like about 2,400 man hours required to fin clip. So it's just something to consider about the effort that goes into this method. One of the other methods we've used in the past is using external anchor tags or T-bar tags. These are just anchored into the fish but are visible, as you can see on this fish here. But again, we're limited by the number that we can tag. It's hand laborious, and we're limited by the size of the fish we could actually implant these things into. A few other options in Europe, USA in particular, and Canada, they use internal tags, magnetic coated wire tags. These things are only about 1 millimetre long. They're implanted with a machine, typically in mass production type methods like this, implanting in excess of 1,000 fish an hour. The wire is implanted into the nose and it's detected by a magnetic detector, and you can then identify fish that have been tagged. Another method might be using silicon type elastomers, and again these are injected into the fish into clear parts, and then you can see it by fluorescence or fluorescing it with a particular light, and it could be quite easy to see. But we're limited again to the physical number of fish that we can tag and the limited number of marks that we can use on this case. Another method that we've played around is using calcine. It's a chemical. So we bathe the fish in this chemical for a period of time, and that chemical is taken up into the hard parts of the fish. And this is an otolith or an ear bone. So when we section that otolith, we can actually see a ring where the calcine is being bound up into the otolith. This has its limitation. It costs about 5 cents a fish to do, and we still have to destructively recover the mark, section the otolith to find that mark in the otolith. So some limitations again, and typically only one mark, so one discriminating method unless we do multiple treatments. So when it comes back to pros and cons, if we look at this table here, various methods, some are more costly than others, some are simple, some we can only batch mark, others we can't identify individuals. So if we come back to the question that we had, we wanted to select a method that was fairly cost effective, and we wanted a legacy project. We wanted to be able to mark every fish that we produced at Snobs Creek cost effectively, simply and easily. So out of all these, we actually ended up picking barium. It's a naturally occurring isotope. We think we can mark them fairly cheaply and cost effectively. So because we're talking about tagging, and because I do have another colleague involved in this project, at this point I'm going to hand over to Fletcher. So tag out, and Fletcher's going to describe this particular method.
Thanks, Brett. I suppose you could say I'm the mad scientist for this part of the project. So I've just got 2 slides, and I'm just going to explain the technique that we're using and the mark that we've created. The technique we've used at Snobs Creek or trialled for the last couple of months is, I call it egg immersion. And I actually developed this technique through my PhD, and it was developed originally for marking Atlantic salmon in Norway. So what this technique involves is, simply if you go to your hatchery, in the hatchery you strip your eggs and your sperm, fertilise them and put them in a bucket, and as soon as you fertilise them we add a solution of barium isotope. It just sits there for 2 hours, and during those 2 hours a lot of you will know that our trout and salmon eggs swell. And they'll take up to nearly sort of 10% in their weight, or in liquid weight, during those first 2 hours. And it's this swelling that, while this occurs, the barium isotope that's in the solution actually gets transferred into the egg. Then after those 2 hours, you simply drain off the solution and transfer your eggs into the hatchery. So it's a nice, simple technique. You can have 10,000 eggs in a bucket, so you can mark a lot of fish or a lot of eggs very quickly. So that's the technique we've been trialling, and we've marked now 1.4 million eggs at the Snobs Creek hatchery using this technique. Now the next question where you'll say, well, what are we actually marking? So what we're actually marking is the otolith of these fish, and in the top left hand corner there you can see there's a fingerling otolith, and the second one here is that's a yolk sac larval otolith, and we're actually marking the core of that otolith with this isotope. So how it actually works is, well, just a little bit more. An otolith is effectively a chemical record of the lifetime of the fish. So as an otolith grows, it uptakes the signature of the chemical environment that the fish is growing in. And the isotope marking effectively just manipulates that chemical signature for a certain period. What we have here, on this axis here, we have a ratio of barium 136 to 138. And on our axis along the bottom, we have the change in that ratio through the entire otolith. So to explain that a bit more, this blue line here is a control fish. And so we've analysed this otolith with a laser, we've started drilling from the edge, we're drilling all the way through to the core of the otolith, and then through the core and back out the other side. And you can see the ratio of 136 to 138 in this fish, and this control fish has not changed very much. It's nice and stable. So that's the natural chemical signature of that fish. Now the question you may be asking, well, what's this big dark blue line? What's happened with this big dark blue line here is this fish has been exposed or being immersed in that solution that's been enriched in barium 136. So effectively what has happened is the ratio of 136 to 138 in the core of that otolith, or when that egg was immersed, so when that otolith first started to grow, that ratio has changed. So we effectively created an isotopic mark. So that's what an isotopic mark looks like. The next question is, how do we guarantee that this is a control fish and that's a mark fish? Well, something to do that, we actually set a detection limit. and we can have a probability. We know that out of all control fish, the isotopic ratio generally never gets above this red line, which is basically 99.94% of all the isotopic ratios you measure in a control fish will be below that line. And so how we guarantee a mark is just to make sure that we adjust that ratio above that line. And I'm going to move it back to Brett now because he's just going to sum up the rest of it.
So pretty simple, really. So what have we done today? As Fletcher said, we've actually marked all the eggs that were spawned at Snobs Creek this year. So it was about 1.4 million eggs. We stripped the fish, collect the eggs in a bucket. Right at the point of fertilisation, we add a fairly small amount of barium solution to it, wait 2 hours, and then put them into our standard incubators. So what does that equate to? Probably about 60 hours of work for us, and about maybe $2,500 in chemicals all up, and we're done. So in terms of ease and simplicity, this kills everything else for dead. So what we've done, coming back to the question from the beginning, is are lake fish or fish stocked into the lake moving into the streams adjacent to the river, to the lake itself? How we're going to answer that is that we've marked brown trout at Snobs Creek using two different isotopes, 137 and 135. So the fish that we're going to stock into the lake, they're marked with 137. We're also going to stock some fish into the rivers, they're marked with 135. So we've done all that. We've also tested a couple of different marking methods just to validate the technique itself, so that's a little bit of science in the background happening. So really, the implications of this I think are quite profound. Having all the fish stocked from the hatchery marked, and the ability to have different batches of fish marked in a different way is really going to assist us in terms of managing and assessing our stocking programs. For example, this project itself, looking at movement of fish from Lake Eildon up into the streams, we can generally look at the contribution of stocked fish to any fishery, anywhere, at any time, because we know that all the fish that we've released are marked. And I think that's a fairly important thing in terms of assessment and management of recreational fisheries. But there's, of course, all these other things that we can now start thinking about that we can do. We can look at questions like, the effects of size at stocking, or are we seeing differences in survival and contribution from different year classes, from one year to the next? And I guess really it's up to our imagination to see how we can utilise this tool to answer, fundamental fisheries management questions. So where to from here? We've marked the eggs. What we need to do now over the next 6 months is grow the fish. So we're going to grow them in facilities at Snobs Creek through the rest of this year and the first half of next year. Obviously, the fish that have been marked with the different barium isotopes are going to be reared in different facilities so we can keep track of them. Sometime around mid-September, we're going to stock these fish out. So a large batch will go into Lake Eildon, and then some smaller batches will go into some of the streams. Again, these will be marked differently. And then from there, by the time we get to 2017, we'll be looking at going back and sampling those populations. We'll use a combination of survey methods like the electrofishing surveys will contribute fish to the sampling, as well as anglers. We'll rely on anglers to provide samples of heads, for example. And then we'll take those samples and analyse the ovids for the presence of these two barium marks, and then from that we'll be able to get an idea about just what's happening with these fish that are stocked into the lake. And really that's where we're at. Thank you.
Authorised by Victorian Government, 1 Treasury Place, Melbourne.